Almost everything in biology comes down to this one thing, and that is Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection. In general, the theory states that species come from other species, and they evolve throughout time. It could be decades, millions of years, and it all comes down to genetics and what gets passed down and what doesn't. That's where natural selection gets its role. And this overall leads to better fitness in the environment, meaning that organisms that do survive and that continue to pass on their genes fit their environment better. One thing to keep in mind is that organisms themselves do not evolve. It is the population or the species as a whole that does evolve. So what are the requirements for natural selection? There's 3. 1. Traits must vary. 2. Traits must affect survival and reproductive rates. And 3. Traits must be heritable. Traits must vary. That means that there has to be a variation across a population. And then that could either be through mutations or genetic recombination. Let's say, for example, we could look at like this little guy right here, a seal. Seals can either be, let's say, fast or slow. And in this whole entire population, there's slow seals and there's fast seals and all the seals in between. And that is the variation in speed. And then the traits must affect survival and reproductive rates. That is whenever the slow seals and the fast seals come hand in hand with nature. Depending on the environment that they are in, the trait that they have might be beneficial or detrimental. For example, let's say that the seal lives in a place where the predators are very, very fast. The slow seal may not make it as far as the fast seal. So, for example, let's say that the slow seal gets eaten very early on in life just because it just can't outrun the predator or outswim the predator. And then the fast seal gets to grow up and have offspring that inherit its fast genes. And that is how the trait for slow swimming kind of gets pushed out of the population. And that goes to point number 3, that traits must be heritable. The fastness or the slowness must be heritable to the next generation, in the offspring. For example, the fast seal's babies are going to be very fast. And then the slow seal, if let's say maybe it did reach maturity, its babies are more than likely going to be on the slower end. And again, the pressures of the predators might this time get those offspring and they might not make it. So like I said earlier, traits can either increase or decrease fitness, and those that increase fitness gets passed down, and those that decrease fitness typically die with those that have them. And then whenever a successful trait does get passed down and it reaches the whole population, it's called an adaptation. And these can include body shape, like maybe let's say torpedo shapes in all the marine mammals, and fur color, and behaviors that are inherited from genetic material. Fur color could be advantageous whenever it allows you to camouflage better, and behaviors could be behaviors that help you avoid predators or better hunting techniques. So let's look at the Trinidian guppies. The Trinidian guppies, scientific name Poecilia reticulata, are a great example of the work of natural selection. These guppies are popular to work with because they reproduce fast. So there is a study in the northern mountains of Trinidad and Tobago in the Caribbean, and these populations of guppies, there are some that lived upstream and downstream of the waterfalls. The populations that lived upstream had weak predation pressure, meaning that they had, the study said that they only had one predator. And then downstream, the guppies had high predation pressure. The scientists also said that there was no gene flow between the two populations, meaning that there was no one going back and forth between them. So natural selection might be doing its work right there. And as expected, they did find some significant differences between the populations. For example, high predation guppies were maturing faster, and they were also having more babies but smaller in size. And then lastly, they spent more resources on reproduction. The low predation guppies, on the other hand, mature later, they have less offspring, and they are larger in size, and they don't use as many resources for reproduction. The reason this is happening is because the high predation guppies have this pressure to keep their genes flowing, to keep their genes alive. So they must focus on reproduction. They mature faster, meaning that they reach sexual maturity faster and reproduce earlier than the lower predation guppies. They also have more offspring. They have many predators that are large in size, but it doesn't matter if the guppies are big or not. They still get eaten, and instead the mother gives more energy into producing many, hoping that some of them will make it. And then in general, the high predation just must use more resources into reproduction because that is what's keeping their population alive, their genetics alive. Otherwise, if they didn't reproduce as much, their genetics could risk being lost when they get eaten by predators. On the other hand, in low predation, there is only one predator, Rivulus hardy, and it can only eat guppies up to a certain size. Once guppies reach a size threshold, they are typically safe. So the mothers are better off producing less offspring and larger offspring because they put in all the energy into these big offspring, and they are more likely to survive if they start off big because they'll take less time in growing. I would also like to clarify that whenever I say the mother puts in extra energy, it doesn't mean that the mother is consciously thinking about how to make her offspring, like making them big or small or more or less. It's the way that natural selection has shaped the way that the guppy moms give birth, and that is through many generations and decades of natural selection. Another example about natural selection working on these guppies is with Anne McGurran's research in the 1990s. This was looking at behavior. They took the opportunity to do research whenever C.P. Haskins moved 200 guppies in 1957, and they moved these from a high predation site to a low predation site. So they wanted to see how over time this population had changed. The guppies that were originally from the high predation would have had anti-predator behaviors because their ancestors faced predators. But what they found was that these guppies actually showed low predation behavior instead of their ancestors' behavior, which was anti-predator behaviors, meaning that natural selection had acted on them. The genes for anti-predator behavior were just no longer needed, so they just went away. Last but not least, I also want to mention that sometimes we forget that we're also evolving, which is crazy. I found 4 great examples that made you think, whoa, like that's so cool, we are evolving. For example, Aboriginal Australians have an adaptation to withstand extremely hot temperatures. In Australia, the deserts can get very hot, and whenever we get hot, thyroxine is released. But too much of it can kill you. So if we're in extremely hot temperatures, the thyroxine can be deadly. But in general, Aboriginal Australians have lower thyroxine levels, and they also have less binding proteins that bind to the thyroxine. So this might be a way to keep them cool. Another example was indigenous populations in the Andes Mountains. Their water sources have traces of arsenic, which is very toxic, but they have adapted to drinking the water with arsenic, and they have tolerance for it now, which is really cool. Another example is that overall, we're all getting taller. I'm on the lower end of that spectrum, but In general, we can see that there's a positive selection for taller humans. And last but not least, there's recent research that suggests that the APOE gene, which is thought to be connected to Alzheimer's disease, is currently being selected out of the population. Which sounds great. Maybe later on in the future, maybe in a couple thousand years, Alzheimer's might not be as common. In general, I just did that to demonstrate that natural selection is always working right in front of our eyes. Even when we don't see it, it's still shaping traits, and it can take thousands of years, but in some cases, like the guppies, it just needs several decades. And that's pretty